Welcome to Jewish History Soundbites podcast with Yehuda Geberer. Immerse yourself in the rich tapestry of Jewish history as we explore fascinating tales and uncover hidden gems from our glorious past. Brought to you by our proud sponsor, Cross River, a leader at the intersection of financial services and technology, committed to empowering the communities they serve. Cross River's steadfast support fuels our mission to preserve our heritage and foster a vibrant future for all. Contact Cross River through their website at crossriver.com.
A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Guerrero.
The 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games.
Zugerechtbare Brüder in Amerika. Verkaufte Schabbos at the Skizar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late.
Yehuda Geberer with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is a continuation of last week. Last week I spoke about the Eichmann execution because Shalom Nagar, the executioner of Adolf Eichmann, had passed away here in Israel, and thought it was an opportune time to do it. And I got such amazing feedback, so today we're back with the Eichmann. And the feedback I got from last one was that I mentioned just a few of the books about the Eichmann capture. There's obviously tons more literature. There's been so much written about Eichmann and his life and his crimes and his trial and everything else. But one very knowledgeable listener said it's worth pointing out to everyone else, and I want to just share what he said, that it's worth highlighting, so to speak, other periods of Eichmann's life, especially in regards to refuting the claims of Hannah Arendt and her coverage of the trial in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, which generated much controversy, which I'll get to momentarily. So much of the Eichmann literature in the ensuing decades after the publication of Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem was to refute her book. In other words, she generated a lot of the literature by causing a response. So two examples of that are David Cesarani's excellent book on Eichmann and his crimes. Really, that's a classic. It's one of the best books written on Eichmann. And Bettina Stangneth's book, which is called Eichmann Before Jerusalem, which really highlights the Eichmann years in Argentina in the 1950s in a very great way, and especially regarding the famous Sasson interviews, which Eichmann gave to this Dutch Nazi named Sasson in 1957 in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, basically justifying all of his crimes and Eichmann's account of his own role in the final solution and in the SS and in World War II. The Sasson interviews exist, and parts of it were produced as evidence at the trial. They have been since used in many other ways, in books and movies, and the Sasson interviews are a very, very important part of the story as well. I want to make one more comment prior to jumping into today's topic. A massive side topic of the Eichmann trial, which I just mentioned briefly a minute ago, which came to dominate public discourse around it for decades, and to a certain extent until today, is Hannah Arendt and her reporting on the trial for the New Yorker. Later, it became more famous and prominent in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, which included the subtitle included her coining the iconic phrase, "the banality of evil," and her controversial statements and assessments regarding the Eichmann trial, her racism, which she expressed towards Eastern European Jews, specifically towards Gideon Hausner himself, who was from Lvov, and in general to Polish Jews and Eastern European Jews, also to Middle Eastern, Oriental Jews. Also her accusations against the Jewish leadership during the Holocaust, which were controversial as well, and a bunch of other exciting topics which she covered in the book. Now, the Hannah Arendt story is an important story, especially the many rebuttals of Arendt over the years, but it's worthy of its own treatment, and perhaps we'll have an episode devoted to that as well. We may as well devote the next few installments to this story until everyone gets sick of it. That's obviously a joke, but maybe we'll have another one about the trial. Maybe we'll have more about the capture. Maybe we'll have one about Hannah Arendt. We can have a few. We can do a mini-series on the Eichmann trial if it works out and if it makes sense to do that. In any event, getting to today's topic, the goal of this Eichmann installment is the Eichmann trial, which took place in Yerushalayim over the course of over 4 months from its opening on April 11th, 1961, with the closing arguments taking place in mid-August. Interesting coincidence with this podcast, worth noting that I just noticed myself. I did last week's episode as what I thought would be a one-off about his execution in honor of the passing of Shalom Nagar, the executioner of Adolf Eichmann. Now, due to overwhelmingly positive listener feedback, I was inundated with positive feedback. It was amazing. By the way, I want to thank you all for that feedback. It was really nice. It keeps me going. Even when I'm not feeling well, as you hear in my voice. But because of all the positive listener feedback, I'm continuing this into a mini-series. This week about the trial of Eichmann, and next week we'll do about the witnesses of the trial. So the trial and the witnesses of the trial are two separate episodes. That's for sure 2 more episodes, today and next week. But maybe more. We'll see if, like I just said before, maybe we'll have even more. We'll see how things develop. But I thought that it was no longer timely. I thought it started because of Shalom Nagar, and it's kind of continuing at random, and it's not relevant really anymore to something timely or current events or anything like that. But it turns out, I just bumped into this while preparing for this episode, that the hundreds of pages long verdict of the Eichmann trial was read over the course of 3 days. Which 3 days? December 11th, 12th, and 13th, 1961. And the sentencing was held 2 days later on December 15th. So that's this week. It's literally the week of the 3 days of the reading of the verdict, and the sentencing is all this week. So an amazing timing. So we're right on course with history as we commemorate the 63rd anniversary of the verdict and sentencing of Eichmann trial together. So today, like I said, I'll focus on the Eichmann trial with some fresh perspective. And before we get to the trial itself, a little background as to how Israel comes to this trial. How does the state of Israel look, and how does Israeli society look, even more importantly? Israeli society didn't really confront the Holocaust before the Eichmann trial. I mentioned that with the story of Mickey Goldman during last episode, but I want to elaborate on it now. There was this indifference at best in the 1940s and 50s to the story of the Holocaust and to survivors. And indifference was in the best case scenario, hostility at worst. I heard many stories from survivors personally. I heard stories also from survivor testimonies on video. In other words, I didn't hear it from them in person, but on their videos. In other words, I've heard it, and I've read it in books. I've read it in articles. It comes up so many times, and most of our audience is American, so you're probably more familiar with the American survivors arriving in America after the Holocaust, which is a whole different experience because the United States isn't a Jewish country. Here in Israel, it was a very, very, very tough situation, a very challenging situation. This Jewish state of Israel, even before the state of Israel in the early years, and this struggling new country, finding its identity, finding its place in the world, and these survivors who are almost like basically like a third of the population in the early years, and how they're treated. I remember watching a testimony of Helena Birnbaum, who's still alive, and she described how she was sent to this kibbutz after she arrived. She was the only survivor from her family. She grew up in a traditional Jewish family in Warsaw. She survived the Great Deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto in the summer of 1942. She survived the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. She was deported to Majdanek, then to Auschwitz, then to a few other camps. She wrote an excellent book, Hope is the Last to Die, highly recommended. But in any event, she has some really amazing stories, but she describes arriving here, and she's the only survivor of her family, and she's on this kibbutz. She was, just deposited there. And the other children of the kibbutz, when she would be on the kibbutz paths, walking, doing her chores, the other children, little children, you're talking about young teenagers, not like how do they even have the sophistication to do this and be so mean? They would make these sheep sounds, meh meh, because she's a survivor, and so she went like sheep to slaughter, because that's what Holocaust victims were. They went like sheep to slaughter. That was the prevailing attitude in the world at the time, and for sure in Israel. So she said that's how she was greeted. That's how she was taunted. Many other stories like that about people who, they weren't interested in hearing the story, or they were taunted in other ways. I could go on and on and on. There's a lot to say about it. I want to get to the trial itself, but maybe we'll get back to this another time as well. It's also a great topic. Either way, no one was interested in hearing about the Holocaust. Everyone was really embarrassed about the Holocaust. The whole idea that the Jewish people went like sheep to slaughter was very embarrassing. So they just wanted to forget about the Holocaust. Let's move on. We're building a state. We're fighting for survival here in the state. We have to build the economy. We have to build families. Let's look towards the future. Forget about the past. And that was really, really how it was. And that's how the entire narrative of the Holocaust was treated, and how the survivors were treated. It was really no knowledge of the Holocaust. No one really understood it because they didn't want to. They didn't want to confront it. So the trauma of the Holocaust is omnipresent. It's there. It's like this huge elephant in the room. And this elephant in the room has to be dealt with, because everyone around the survivors, everyone's got numbers on their own. Remember, survivors aren't 90-year-olds in nursing homes in those days. They're 25-year-olds getting jobs, serving in the army, going to university, building families, having children. It's there. It's hanging in the air. Everyone, not only survivors, everyone in the Yishuv basically had lost relatives in the war, in the Holocaust. So, I mean, this affected everyone almost everyone in the country. So it was there. It was this elephant in the room. Not only that, but there was practical ramifications as well, and this leads us directly to Eichmann. In 1950, the Israeli Knesset, in one of its earliest laws, passes a law that is related to the Holocaust. Surprise, surprise. When they're not confronting the Holocaust, they pass 1950. This is basically right after the guns fall silent of the War of Independence. There's one of the earliest laws of the Knesset. They pass a law called Chok Asiyat Din Im Hanatzim Ve'ozrehem, the law of doing justice with the Nazis and their collaborators, in 1950. Now, why in the world is the Knesset passing this law? I spoke about this on an episode a long time ago, a few years ago, about kapos, Jewish kapos, and you might want to check out that episode to refresh your memory if you're interested, or if you didn't hear it at the time. But in 1950, the State of Israel was not planning on capturing Eichmann or any other Nazi. What about collaborators? So in 1950, the State of Israel was not planning on capturing John Demjanjuk or extraditing Demjanjuk or any other Ukrainian or Latvian or French or Dutch or any other collaborator. So why did they make this law? It seems to be a meaningless law. So it was for Jewish collaborators. Jewish collaborators were living in, or people who were understood at the time to be Jewish collaborators were living in Israel at the time. Those were kapos, ghetto police, Judenrat members. So they were considered collaborators by many. And this entire law was passed for them. And throughout the 1950s, there are these capo trials. Over 50 capo trials. A traumatized nation in the 1950s is doing trials of capos. That's what they're busy with. An amazing story. It's an untold story. It's buried today. I spoke a lot about this story in that episode way back. You may want to check it out. If I remember, then I will post a link to that episode in the show notes. If I don't, please don't throw tomatoes at me. So that's what now it's lucky they passed this law in 1950 because Eichmann was tried under this law. So it did come in handy. And had the Knesset not passed this law, they would not have been able to try Adolf Eichmann in Israel. So it worked out pretty conveniently that they had this law in place when they kidnapped Adolf Eichmann. So if that's the case, then why did the Mossad decide to go and find and capture Eichmann in 1959, 1960? Was the Mossad after him for years? Many times I've seen articles that said, yes, the Mossad was after him for years. That's not true. The Mossad was not after him for years. Absolutely not. Isser Harel, the Mossad, Ben Gurion, and the State of Israel had, I wouldn't say zero interest, but nearly zero interest in finding Eichmann or other Nazis altogether at this time. They were a new country with very few resources, surrounded by enemies who wanted to destroy it. They were trying to build up an economy. They were trying to integrate hundreds of thousands of new immigrants. They were trying to defend their borders. They were trying to survive. The last thing they'd devote intelligence and financial resources to was to find a Nazi on the other side of the globe. So why did they go after him? Because they were pressured to. There were other people who were after him. Simon Wiesenthal in Vienna, Tuvia Friedman, who was another survivor, who also was in Vienna, but later moved to Israel. He was based out of Haifa. In fact, my friend and colleague, Davi Safir, a few years ago, wrote an article in Mishpacha magazine showing how Rabbi Avram Kalmanovich of the Mir Yeshiva also was looking out for Adolf Eichmann for some time in the 1950s. Nachum Goldman of the World Jewish Congress in America, he wasn't really looking for him, but he was like a coordinator a little bit between Rabbi Avram Kalmanovich and others. And a fellow by the name of Lothar Herman, who lived in Buenos Aires, who was nearly blind from a Gestapo beating, and his daughter, who was half Jewish or a quarter Jewish, I forget how Jewish his daughter was dating by pure chance, coincidence, hashgacha, mazel, whatever it is, to dating Eichmann's son, which is what eventually led to finding him. So Lothar Herman plays a crucial role in finding Adolf Eichmann. And I would say last but not least, he is probably the most important in this whole story, is a Jewish prosecutor in Germany named Fritz Bauer. And Fritz Bauer had escaped to Denmark during the 1930s from the Nazis, and he later escaped to Sweden with Danish Jewry. And then later, when he comes back to Germany after the war and he gets his old Steller back, and he's a prosecutor again, and he did not trust the West German government or justice system that they would prosecute Eichmann or they would extradite him. So he did not share the information that he had on Eichmann with the West German government that employed him. He instead sent it to the Mossad, which is an amazing thing. This guy's a German citizen, a German Jew. He's a prosecutor, a very high-level guy in the West German justice system. But he knew that the West German government was teeming with Nazis, and the West German government was not going to, they probably would tip off Eichmann before he's extradited, and he would go into hiding again. So instead, Fritz Bauer hands over all this information to the Mossad. And the Mossad ignores it. But Fritz Bauer, to get under pressure from Lothar Herman, pressures the Mossad. So ultimately the Mossad caves to the pressure of Fritz Bauer. Or as one of my colleagues in Yad Vashem said so eloquently, Isser Harel, the head of the Mossad, wanted to get Fritz Bauer off his back already. He was driving him crazy. So he said, Yalla, let's just get Eichmann already, and then Fritz Bauer will stop bothering us. That's basically what happened. I think that's a somewhat less well-known part of the story. It's not that the Mossad actually initiated it. But in any event, the Mossad went after him, and Ben-Gurion gave the go-ahead. And then this develops into an idea of let's use it. Once we're getting him anyway, let's try to do something with it. And this is Ben-Gurion's plan. They find him and they capture him, and all the drama and further drama with transporting him to Israel. And of course, these are very dramatic stories, which we'll get back to another time. In fact, because it's relevant to current events, a diplomatic incident between Israel and Argentina at the time. Not only Israel and Argentina, but Israel and the United States, Israel and West Germany, because they violated the sovereignty of Argentina, and they kidnapped him, a foreign national, and brought him to Israel. It was all illegal. But my favorite part of that diplomatic incident is that the kidnapping of Adolf Eichmann by Mossad agents of the State of Israel was condemned by the United Nations. So there you go. The UN from 1960 until 2024, and probably earlier, is condemning things like kidnapping Adolf Eichmann. In any event, so now they bring him to Israel. Now they're going to have a trial. So the question was, is it legal for the State of Israel to have a trial? What's the problem? What's the problem with the legality? So these are very interesting technical legal questions. But for starters, there was no State of Israel at the time of the crimes of Adolf Eichmann. So what right does the State of Israel, assuming that Adolf Eichmann is the guiltiest person in the world, he's the worst Nazi criminal murderer, sadist, evil person. But how is the State of Israel, how are they supposed to be the one who prosecutes him? It was the State of Israel versus Adolf Eichmann, right? That's the case. There was no State of Israel at the time of his crimes, and even if there was, he did not perpetrate any of his crimes within the geographical borders of the State of Israel. So, if anything, West or East Germany could prosecute him. Hungary, Poland, Greece, and Slovakia, Czech Republic, about 20 other countries in Europe could probably prosecute him. Soviet Union, France, Holland, but not Israel. Why is Israel part of the story here? It was in a different country and a different legal system, and Israel didn't exist. Not only that, but the law that it was trying him under, Chok Asiyat Din Imanatzim Vozrehem, didn't exist at the time that he did his crimes, 1950. They were trying him under precedent of the Nuremberg trials, but the Nuremberg trials themselves were legally problematic from a technical standpoint, not morally problematic, obviously, because the laws, so to speak, were created by the Allied victors, the victorious Allies, in order to prosecute the Nazi criminals. So here we're borrowing that concept for Eichmann too. Eichmann, operating under his own country's legal system, in other words, Nazi Germany, was carrying out the law. He did not break any laws. All right. So if you want to get into the technical legalities, there was all kinds of problems, which Eichmann's defense team used at the trial. They tried to make the whole trial illegal. So there was always limitations, but the conclusion was of Israeli lawyers and jurists and legal minds was that it was completely legal, and it was within Israel's jurisdiction as representatives of the Jewish people. So that means the only right that the State of Israel had to do it is that they represent the Jewish people. It's important to keep that in mind as well. Okay, so the legality of the trial is settled. Now we have the venue of the trial. In fact, I have some personal experience with the building. Today, right on the corner of Rehov Bitzalel and Usishkin, it's a very prominent corner, right before Rechavia, right in the center of town. right a block away from King George. So the really, really central area, right behind Nachlaot. It's a corner of Betzal and Usishkin. There's this pretty impressive large building. Today, half of it is a library, a city library, and the other half is a like performances, like a small theater. It's called Gerard Bachar, probably named for someone, I don't know. At that time, the same exact building was called Beit Ha'am, and it was also for cultural events and all kinds of things like that. Either way, when I was in school a few years ago, I would go study there with my friend, a dear friend who's on the front now, and he should be safe and protected. So we used to study together in the library there, in the city library as a central location. It was just easy, convenient for us to study there. So we used to meet there all the time to study. So we're in the library studying one day, and he says to me, "By the way, do you know what historical event took place in this building before it was a library?" I said, "No." He said, "This was where the Eichmann Trial took place." Well, needless to say, I didn't get any studying that day. I was just overwhelmed by the historical presence of where I was sitting. It was amazing. This was a special place, a holy building almost, where justice, in any event, so that's where the venue was, and the reason the venue was there, even though it was not a courtroom, it was not a courthouse, because there was no courthouse that was large enough in Yerushalayim for spectators and the media to be. Yerushalayim was a small town in 1961, so before the 6-Day War, Yerushalayim is a tiny little sleepy town, divided in half by barbed wire because half of the city is in Jordanian hands. And they never had big courtrooms. And here, this is going to be the trial of the century. They need it to be rigged with cameras. They need to be media. They need to be hundreds of spectators who want to see it. This was like a major event. So they basically reworked this Beit Ha'am into a courtroom. It was never really a courtroom before or after, just for this. And the justices of the trial, 3 justices, Moshe Landau, Binyamin Halevi, who is a name you might be familiar with because he was the sole judge at the Kastner, at what's incorrectly referred to as the Kastner trial a few years earlier, and Yitzchak Rave. All 3 were German Jews, no shock there, they're the justices. Moshe Landau was the head chief justice, and the defense team, Eichmann's lawyer, was Robert Servatius, who was a German lawyer. He defended a bunch of Nazis at Nuremberg. He refused to ever conduct an interview for his entire life, so very little is known about his motives. But the defense strategy of Robert Servatius and his assistants was to defend Eichmann on these grounds, was several-fold. First of all, the main and most famous part of the defense was that Eichmann was only following orders. That was a classic Nuremberg defense. The second was that Eichmann was a small cog in the system. And this Eichmann himself drew a diagram. I think the diagram exists. I think it's part of the court records. During the trial, he drew a diagram showing the SS hierarchy and his position in it. And he wanted to show it that he's just a small, tiny little cog in the entire system. How much could he have done already? He's this tiny little insignificant part in this huge, massive system called the SS. The third defense strategy was that Eichmann was not a murderer. He was just a train schedule operator. He was a office guy, a desk bureaucrat. He organized train schedules. Now, never mind that those train schedules were organizing deportations of Jews from all over Europe to death camps. That's what he was coordinating, and that's what his mastery was. He was the deportations master, which is arguably the most important and crucial part of the final solution. But that's what he wanted to say. I didn't take a gun and shoot people. I didn't pour Zyklon B into the gas chambers, so how can I be called a murderer? Murderers are only who do those kind of things. I just sat in an office and organized train schedules. That was another defense. Another defense was that, strange defense, that Eichmann claimed he was not motivated by hate, he was not motivated by anti-Semitism, he was not motivated by Nazi ideology or anything else. He was just an officer, and an officer has a sense of duty, he follows orders, and he had no other motivation at all. He was a robot, he was a machine. Now, all of those are false, right? He wasn't, and that's what the prosecution proved throughout the trial, that all of that was false. I just find it interesting that this was his defense strategy. Now, another interesting and not so well-known tidbit about Eichmann's defense is that he did not have any assets with which to pay his lawyer. And since he had to have a defense attorney by law, so the one who footed Mr. Servatius's bill to defend Eichmann was the state of Israel, or better said, the Israeli taxpayer. So Israeli taxpayers paid for Eichmann's defense at his trial. It's an amazing story. So that was the defense. Who was the prosecution? The prosecution was, the main prosecutor was obviously Gideon Hausner, the Attorney General of the State of Israel at the time, and the main player in the whole thing. But he had a whole team of assistants. There's the whole police team assembled. We spoke about last time, Mickey Goldman. There was one of the interesting assistant prosecutors, worth noting, just because in the pictures you see him as looking as this real Orthodox Jew. His name was Yaakov Bar Or. His Hebraicized name was Bar Or. His German name, he was a Yeki, was a German Jew, was Yaakov Breuer. Yaakov Breuer as in Isaac Breuer's son, Dr. Isaac Breuer's son. Dr. Isaac Breuer, obviously the son of Rabbi Dr. Solomon Breuer, the chief rabbi of the separatist Orthodox community of Frankfurt, the son-in-law of Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch. So his son, and one of the heads of Agudas Yisrael, right? So Isaac Breuer's son, Yaakov Breuer, is one of the prosecutors at the Eichmann trial. He was a prominent lawyer and had an interesting career. So because of his fluency in German, most of Gabriel Bach and most of Hausner, who was Polish, was a Galicianer. He was from Lvov. So most of Hausner's assistants were German or had a proficiency in German. They had to read all the German documents. They had to understand German. So Yaakov Bar Or was assigned the prosecution for the Jews, the Eichmann's crimes regarding the Jews of Germany and Austria and Theresienstadt ghetto and a few other places. The goals of the State of Israel and the prosecution, in other words, of the State of Israel, Ben Gurion, and of Gideon Hausner with the trial, were an interesting set of goals. And this is really probably the most important part of the story. Actually want to use the opportunity to read another passage from my favorite book about Eichmann, which I mentioned last week, Hunting Eichmann by Neil Bascom. Great book. So I want to read from the epilogue. Is that how you pronounce it? Epilogue? The end of the book. So I'm going to read a passage from there, and that will really explain what the trial was about. Elie Wiesel, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, author, and Auschwitz survivor, attended the Eichmann trial as a reporter. Years later, he said that the capture and trial of the Nazi war criminal showed that Jewish history had a tremendous sense of imagination. A few Jews caught him and brought him to justice. They didn't kill him, which they could have done in Buenos Aires. No, they brought him to the free and sovereign state of Israel, where men could serve as his judges. The trial was almost more important in the field of education than in the field of justice. It was important for the Israeli youth to know what had happened, where we came from. And that's what the Eichmann trial really did. But not only in Israel. The real turning point was the awareness of the world towards the tragedy of the Jewish people. David Ben-Gurion had achieved his... This is the end of the Elie Wiesel quote. It's going back to Neil Bascom's summary of the trial. David Ben-Gurion had achieved his ambition. The trial had a profound impact on Israel. It unified the country in a way it had not been unified since the 1948 war. It educated the Israeli public, particularly the young, on the true nature of the Holocaust. And after 16 years of silence, it allowed survivors to openly share their experiences. The trial also reinforced to Israelis that a sovereign state for Jews was essential for their survival. As for the rest of the world, the Eichmann affair rooted the Holocaust in the collective cultural consciousness. The intensive coverage and the wave of Eichmann biographies and fantastic accounts of his capture contributed to the process. The debate stirred by the trial, particularly after the publication of Eichmann in Jerusalem by Hannah Arendt in 1963, nourished and strengthened those roots. Her comments on the banality of evil paled in comparison to the firestorm caused by her criticism of the trial and her indictment of many Jews as essentially having been complicit in their own extermination during the war. Hundreds of articles and books were published to counter or support her arguments, causing a thorough and passionate re-examination of the history of the genocide. The Holocaust was finally anchored in the world's consciousness, never to be forgotten, by the outpouring of survivor memoirs, scholarly works, plays, novels, documentaries, paintings, museum exhibits, and films that followed in the wake of the trial and that still continue today. This consciousness in Israel and throughout the world is the enduring legacy of the operation to capture Adolf Eichmann. That, I think, is really a fantastic summary and really, really tells us what the trial was about. Because, if I would say it in my way, many of the witnesses who we're going to discuss next week were not directly related to Eichmann or his crimes. They didn't know what Eichmann did. Their testimonies had no bearing on Eichmann's crimes and his culpability. Not all of them. I said some of them. Many of them. But the goal of the prosecution, the goal of Ben-Gurion in the state of Israel, more than just the prosecution. Hausner was doing Ben-Gurion's bidding, obviously. Their goal was to present the entirety of the narrative of the Holocaust in its entire scope and chronology and geography. That was the goal. Eichmann was just a backdrop. He was almost like a prop to his own trial. His guilt and his conviction was basically for a foregone conclusion. I once was in a lecture in Yad Vashem, and I forget the name of the lecturer, but he was speaking about the Eichmann trial, and he said a very extreme and a dramatic statement. He said to us, "Do you know who saved the Eichmann trial?" Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann saved the Eichmann trial. You know why? Because the first 3 hours of the trial was Moshe Landau reading the indictment, 15 counts of the indictment. And after every single count, Eichmann said, "Not guilty." And because he said not guilty, that enabled the trial to take place. If he would have pled guilty, there would have been no trial. And he would have been guilty and geendigt, fartig, geendigt amaisa. There would have been no trial, no show, no anything. The purpose of the trial was to have the trial, not to make Eichmann guilty. He was obviously going to be guilty. That wasn't the question. The purpose of the trial was to have the trial. The theatrics of Hausner, which so many people derided and criticized, to me, that was the purpose. That was the goal. Hausner was very cognizant of what he was doing. That was the whole point. The parade of witnesses, over 100 witnesses, each one from a different region and area, and each one telling a different story. The purpose was to present the Holocaust to the world, to present the Holocaust to the media, to present the Holocaust to the Jewish people, to Israel, to Israeli society, its people, to finally confront the Holocaust in all of its tragedy, in all of its horror. That was the goal. And like I said before, there was an elephant in the room in Israeli society, Ben-Gurion and Hausner. And really the State of Israel establishment, they realized this capturing Adolf Eichmann, which was kind of thrust upon them and was miraculously successful. Now it gives them an opportunity, because how are you supposed to do it? You can't just decide one day, let's confront the Holocaust. This is enabling it. The Eichmann trial is enabling Israel and the Jewish people and the world to confront the Holocaust. He's the enabler. He's the background. he's really almost like a sideshow. He's not really an important part of the Eichmann trial. If I would say who was the least important part of the Eichmann trial, it was Adolf Eichmann. Who was the important part of the trial? The victims of the Holocaust. Because their story was being told, and to a lesser extent, the survivors of the Holocaust, because now their story could be told. And the third beneficiary was the world and the Jewish people who now were able to confront the Holocaust. Eichmann himself, as a person, as a criminal, he's like almost a footnote of the trial. Yeah, he's guilty. Obviously he's guilty. Of course he's guilty. He's an evil monster. We knew that before the trial even started. So that's a very, very important part of the story that I wish to emphasize. And we'll continue next week. And next week I want to start with Hausner's opening speech to the trial, which is arguably one of the greatest opening speeches at a trial opening ever ever delivered. To many, it did not belong in a courtroom. It belonged on Broadway. It was more theatrics and drama than a lawyer prosecutor doing his job. But he understood that he was talking to history. And there were 750 spectators in attendance at every session of the trial. There was huge media coverage. There was cameras at every angle in the courtroom. So it was able to be reported and delivered live. I think either all or most of the video footage of the trial is available on YouTube. It's free, so you can check it out if you're interested in that kind of thing. But next week I want to start with Hausner's opening speech, and maybe we'll read another passage from the book because it's becoming a habit of mine, and we'll go to the witnesses of the trial, which is a great story as well. So this was Yehuda Gerber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudagerber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.